By human nature, none of us want to believe that the end is nigh. And I don't think boards of trustees think that. And I know, because again, there's been research about this and I've written about this, that often, I'll be honest, and again, I'm just painting with a broad brush, generally boards of trustees know what college administrators tell them. And often college administrators don't want to tell them that we're failing, that we're overspending our endowment, that we're running an annual deficit. I mean, when you look at some of the deficits that these small colleges are posting, you just sort of wonder how they even got this far.
Welcome to Small College America, a podcast dedicated to exploring the role and value of small colleges across the higher education landscape. I'm Kent Barnds, Executive Vice President at Augustana College, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dean Hoke, co-founder of Edu Alliance Group. Dean?
Well, thank you. And today we're joined by Jon Marcus, a senior higher education reporter at the Hechinger Report, whose recent reporting has helped bring national attention to a sobering reality that possibly hundreds of small colleges may be at risk of closure or merger in the years ahead. His reporting has appeared widely, including NPR, The Post, New York Times, and he co-hosts also a higher education podcast called College Uncovered. In addition to his reporting, Jon teaches journalism at Boston College and holds a master's in journalism from Columbia. Jon, welcome to Small College America. And by the way, I want to say that if you really don't know, Hechinger is a nonprofit agency. They do work in higher education, does reporting as opposed to maybe some of our commercial colleagues, and has done an outstanding job over the years. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks for what you say about Hechinger. We're a nonprofit newsroom. We also cover K through 12, but we write about higher education in collaboration with those national outlets that you mentioned.
Very good.
Well, Jon, it's great to have you, and we're just going to go right for it. So I'm going to kick things off with the first question. And Jon, we'd love to start with your April 13 reporting on the projection that 442 private colleges are at risk of closing or merger over the next decade. That's a pretty striking number, and something that certainly we took notice of. When you reported that, did it surprise you? And what does it really tell us about the state of higher education right now?
Well, let me answer your first question first. Did it surprise me? I think that over the years, higher education journalists have predicted the demise of small colleges and over and over again and been proven wrong. There have been a few reasons for that. The most important one was, ironically, COVID-19, because COVID-19 was accompanied by federal bailout money that kept a lot of colleges going that might not otherwise have stayed afloat. Was I otherwise surprised? Since COVID-19, almost 100 colleges have closed, and I've visited many of them, and it's very sad. Disproportionate number of those small colleges, almost all of them are small. What these colleges have in common that are at risk are that they are small, they are regional, meaning that they're not well known outside their home states, and they're tuition dependent, meaning they have very small endowments. There's something else that we began to notice they had in common, which is that a disproportionate number of them were religiously affiliated. And these are largely Catholic colleges in rural places that attract students who might not feel comfortable at a large public university. They are among the only options in rural places, which, as you know, have far too few colleges and universities. And we visited some of them. I did a story in particular at a couple of Catholic colleges in Iowa with NPR, and you meet these students and it breaks your heart. The colleges we visited actually weren't closing. They were merging to avoid closing, which was very smart strategically. But this was very much on the minds of students, that this was a very important kind of an institution for them in these places. In respect to the surprise more broadly, these new numbers come from Huron Consulting Group. 442 colleges are projected or are at risk. They're at various types of risk. About 120 of them are at the most serious risk. That pretty much follows on other estimates from people like the Federal Reserve, which last year estimated more than 80 colleges at serious risk. So the fact that there are more of them makes sense, given what's going on more broadly in the market, which we can talk about why they're closing. And this number to that degree didn't surprise me, other than the fact that it just keeps going up, getting worse.
Yeah. Well, let's keep talking a little bit about the article. You started off that piece about a little school up in Vermont, right? It was Sterling College, if I remember right.
A very little college. One of
Yeah.
the
Tell me about that and why did you frame
so I'm
around
really
Sterling?
I'm really glad you asked that. Many of the colleges that have closed with days to go before the new semester or with a few weeks until commencement, increasingly as colleges are kind of giving into the reality of what's going to happen to them, they are doing something kinder. Not as we actually got an email from a reader saying it's not particularly compassionate to close a college, that it's not compassionate to your students to close your college generally, but it's at least more compassionate to do it with some runway so they have time to transfer and find someplace else to go. So Sterling gave us an unaccustomed opportunity to come to a college where the students knew at least more than a semester ahead of time that the college was going to close. And I'm really glad we did that because it gave a human dimension to this, more than just the statistics we've been discussing. It let us meet these students and understand why these colleges are important to them. It also was the kind of small college that I think is really important for reasons I've learned, and that did surprise me as I've covered colleges closing, about why it matters when a college closes. Yeah, it matters that people are out of work. It matters that students have to transfer somewhere else. It matters to the local economy. It matters to the pizza shops. It matters to the tax rate and to the housing prices. But what really matters, especially in rural places like northern Vermont, and Sterling is the seventh college in Vermont to close in 10 years. It was in the middle of nowhere in the Northeast Kingdom, which is way up north near the Canadian border. That is a state with a very old population, one of the three oldest populations by average age after Maine and New Hampshire.
Hmm.
And if you lose a small college, what you're losing that I think people overlook is a pipeline that brings young people to these communities who graduate and stay. And they start companies or they work in businesses and they bring some vitality. They have kids, they start families. That's what I think going to Sterling College gave us an opportunity to do. Our timing was kind of inadvertently, I don't know if you'd call this good or bad. It was the day before Hampshire College closed, and then Anna Maria
Yes.
College in Massachusetts closed. And so this is beginning to speed up. I think you're going to see more colleges close. We're in commencement season. That's often when boards of trustees meet and pull the plug.
Well, let me kind of keep going down this path for a few moments. I mean, you brought up something that I read when you were putting this together, that this was the seventh school in Vermont alone. Um, and while I keep up nationally what's going on, I don't think I realized, good heavens, Vermont, this little state, has just lost seven of their schools over a 10-year period. One of the things that occurs to me about this, though, is what happens to these students? I mean, do they go on? Do they readily transfer? What happens to them?
There's research into this by the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association. And what they find is that half of students at colleges that close continue their educations, half of them stop.
Yeah.
The half that continue their educations, half of them eventually get degrees, half of them never do. So it's really bad news, is the short answer to your question, for these students. I've met students who were at a college that closed and transferred to another college that then closed. So they went through this twice. And there are teach out agreements in which successor colleges will agree to accept students. I've come to be, I know that many teach out colleges are very stable and they have the best intentions of students at heart. Some of them I've come to learn are as the colleges that closed and are anxious to recruit students from closing colleges because they need to fill seats too. I've seen many of those teach out colleges then close. And when you mention Vermont, There's one other characteristic that a lot of small colleges in trouble have in common, and that's that they're in the Northeast and the Midwest. And there's two reasons for that. One is that the demographics are terrible. The birth rate is very low in the Northeast and Midwest. I don't know, maybe because it's really cold. But also, there are a lot of colleges in those two places, just because historically that's where the population grew fastest and first. And so we have all of these very old, small, private liberal arts colleges, probably more of them than the market can sustain.
Yeah. Kent?
It's interesting. I think about these closed colleges. I think sometimes about their alumni, right? Never having the opportunity to take their children back to a place where maybe they met a spouse and everything. There is a human dimension. And I'm so glad your reporting has focused on that and uncovered that human dimension. I'd not thought about in a state with the average age of Vermont about the need to attract youth too. So thank you. You've noted in your reporting that about 20% of college leaders have had serious discussions about mergers. From what you've seen, are institutions still too hesitant to pursue partnerships or mergers early enough in the process? And what have you seen that gets in the way? Because a merger is oftentimes a pathway. You mentioned the two schools in Iowa that I'm very familiar with, right across the river from one of them. And they seem like they're on a really good pathway and they did it at the right time. But a lot of places just wait too long. What are the circumstances behind that?
Because by human nature, none of us want to believe that the end is nigh. And I don't think boards of trustees think that. And I know, because again, there's been research about this and I've written about this, that often, I'll be honest, and again, I'm painting with a broad brush, generally boards of trustees know what college administrators tell them. And often college administrators don't want to tell them that we're failing, that we're overspending our endowment, that we're running an annual deficit. I mean, when you look at some of the deficits that these small colleges are posting, you just sort of wonder how they even got this far. Or they're in institutional debt. This is another thing I think a lot of sort of mainstream consumers of higher education don't understand. When they think about debt and college, they're thinking about student loan debt. But institutional debt is enormous. And colleges are borrowing like crazy and have borrowed in the past to the extent that servicing the debt is now taking up more than 10% of their operating revenue. So, and to your earlier point about the human dimension, I've seen colleges that have closed. I've been there and you see the pictures on the walls of previous classes, and you see at another college actually in Vermont called Green Mountain, where there were still bicycles leaning against the walls in the hallways of the dorms. Another one in, where was I? Western Ohio, a small Catholic college that closed, where one of the nuns had stayed to create an archive. And so her realm was the library in this campus that was otherwise almost completely empty. And in the library, it looked like college was still in session and everything was still exactly in place. And so to answer your question, I think people wait too long because they don't want to admit that they might close. There's another more practical reason, though, that mergers often don't work, is that they shouldn't work unless the two institutions are complementary in some way. You can't merge two colleges that do exactly the same thing because there's no advantage to it. There are a few colleges that have done very strategic mergers where they've added entirely new majors, entirely new kinds of departments, which bring them entirely new students. And what they realize are savings from the per unit cost of the students. They are able to, with the same number of administrators, attract more students doing more kinds of things. Whereas if you take two students that do exactly the same thing, you're not saving any money and you're not attracting anybody else. So some mergers just aren't wise. And many colleges in trouble when they approach stronger colleges, financially more stable colleges, and propose a merger, the more stable colleges sort of look at them and say, why? There's nothing in it for us. On occasion, there is something in it for them. There have been colleges that close where where it's technically called a merger, but essentially one college closes and the successor institution gets the endowment, it gets the real estate. That's not helping anybody. That's not helping the students. It's not keeping the campus open. So there's a lot of ways that these mergers are happening. It's still a relatively new phenomenon in higher education. And I think that people are still figuring it out. But what they're generally figuring it out is it doesn't always help.
Thank you.
I want to put you in a different seat for a moment. You're generally going to the colleges, you're reporting, you have a lot of data. But you mentioned boards. And let's say all of a sudden some president decides, we're having our board retreat. How about you coming? And you are the speaker to that board of trustees. They may know a lot, they may know nothing, who knows? I'd be very curious about what would you talk to them about? What would you present, considering your knowledge of what's going on, particularly in the small college world?
Wow, that's a big question. I think journalists often are more, we listen to people who are experts. I can tell you from the point of view, rather than pretend to be experts ourselves. And people on boards often are, they do have a lot of knowledge, and it's knowledge that their university administration should take advantage of. And I've written about this. I've written a book about this. It hasn't come out yet, but I spoke with a guy who believed passionately in the small college he attended in Michigan, so passionately that he lobbied to become a member of the board. And if you know people that are members of college boards, it's a generally thankless job. He admitted that in some ways he worked at a big law firm. Members of the board sort of, it's a good way to get business. But in his case, it was because he had a heartfelt love for his college. And then he got to see how the sausage was made. And they were getting the financial data from the administration, and no one on the board was questioning it. When in fact, the board members were lawyers and CEOs and corporate executives and people whose knowledge could be of use to the administration. So I guess what I would say to boards, the first thing I would say to them is assert yourselves. Do your job, because boards often they like to go to the football game. They like to go to commencement. And this guy too, he finally quit the board, but he waited until the final commencement so that he got to march in the last commencement before he took the chairman of the board aside and said, I'm done. And so they need to really bear down on these administrators, or in one way or another, either say, do this better or we can help. But right now, many boards, and it's not just me saying this, there's been a lot of work by AGB, the Association of Governing Boards, and others suggesting that they really need to more assert themselves now more than ever. It was fine to be passive when there was an endless supply of students and everything was going great. That's not true anymore. And now it's time for them to take their expertise and apply it to the college. The second thing I would say to them from the point of view where I do have some level of expertise is make an argument for higher education, which no one is doing. For the last year, critics of higher education and people who are claiming that it's woke and who are it's a target in the culture wars, they have controlled the narrative because colleges and universities and presidents in particular and chancellors haven't wanted to stand up and draw attention to themselves by arguing the contrary, by arguing the value of higher education. And it's really important that someone make that case, because our college going numbers, it gets to how we started the conversation. The reason colleges are closing is because there's fewer 18-year-olds, and of the high school graduates that are emerging, fewer of them, a smaller proportion of them, a dramatically smaller proportion are going to college. That's in a world in which our economic rivals are hugely increasing college going, while in the United States, it's declining. Someone needs to stand up and make that case that not everybody needs to go to college, but that somebody does, for the sake of all of our standards of living, for the sake of supporting retiring baby boomers who need somebody to pay into Social Security, for all of those reasons. And that's the other case I'd make to boards is somebody stand up and say that.
Just for a second, I'd like to follow up with that a little bit. Usually that had been the role for decades, to Heshberg at Notre Dame, to some of the other great university presidents and the elites. But I was trying to think.
Sober at BU. Yeah, those were people that had a soapbox and used it.
Yeah, but I haven't seen that so much from the small colleges, and maybe because they don't, I wonder at times that they feel like they would be heard. I'm curious about that. And Kent, you have a direct line into that conversation as well, being with
Well,
us.
I'd say two things. I think the one exception is the president at Wesleyan University in Connecticut, who has been incredibly outspoken and has been a bit of a champion. I don't know that there have been a lot of people who have been following close behind him and saying, hey, attaboy. So he's kind of a voice in the wilderness. I do think that the point is fair that as colleges and universities have examined their role, they tend to be more likely. I mean, in fact, we have at Augustana a policy relative to what public issues we'll engage in, which we won't. And I think that probably has resulted in us having a level of discomfort about making a case for higher education in general and the existential crisis that we face. Jon, you hit on something that I think is really important to this conversation and leads into the next question. And that is the non-consumptive 17 and 18-year-olds, those students who are not doing anything post high school. If we just change that college going rate, I mean, we spend so much time on the demographic cliff, but that college going rate, it's falling and that should be increasing. So I'm glad that you brought that up. And it leads me to the question about parent perception. There's some mixed messages out there, whether we look at political party affiliation, we look at those who have students who've graduated from college or those who have students who may be entering college. What's your sense of the perception of the value of college by parents? And have we entered a moment where it's all about commodification of the bachelor's degree? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that. I think that what people say about higher education and the way they actually behave is different. And I say that from personal experience of talking to people who respond to stories that I write by saying, colleges are woke. I hate the thought of sending my kids to a college because they're going to be indoctrinated. I'm not sure that holds up to scrutiny. If you look at the freshman survey that's produced by the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA, they survey freshmen nationwide. Used to be every year or around every year. It happens periodically now. 18-year-olds, if your listeners remember being 18, everyone that's 18 is liberal. That's and this survey is conducted of freshmen before they set foot in a classroom, and they believe in gun control and therefore the right to an abortion and all of this other stuff. They haven't met a faculty member when they take that survey. So I'm not sure that holds up, but I will say that among these parents that tell me how woke colleges and universities are and how liberal, and again, we can argue back and forth to the degree to which that's true, when I reach out to them and say, I want to incorporate your point of view into my story, they'll say, oh, no, I don't want to say that publicly because I want my kid to get into the University of Michigan. And so I'm not sure how that squares. I think that it's one thing to sort of like publicly bemoan colleges and what people think they're doing to their kids, and another to actually act on that when many parents, including especially parents that have gone to college themselves, would never think of their kids not going to college. So now, having said that, it's also incontrovertible that the proportion of high school graduates going to college has declined from a high of 70% in 2016 to about 60% now. That's a massive drop. And that does reflect parents, not necessarily, survey data suggests that they question the value of college. I think what they question is the value for money of college. I think that the cost is, even though for a while it was actually increasing at less than the rate of inflation, it's still very expensive. And that was tuition, by the way, that was increasing at the less than the rate of inflation. Housing and dining for students that go to residential college is still going up faster than the rate of inflation. So it's an incredibly expensive commodity. Parents are wondering about the value of that. Students are wondering about that in a labor market that's changing by the day. So it's understandable that there's that perception, and the numbers are showing it. Although, again, I think a lot of parents still want their kids to go to college.
Yeah. I appreciate that. And I also wanted to just kind of claw back to your role of the board to become champions for higher ed. I hope that is amplified with our listeners. I'll turn to Dean for the last question, Jon.
Yeah, Jon, we do a traditional last question, which to no great surprise is about the future. And I mean, you have years of experience of looking and reporting on what's been going on in higher education. All at the Magic 8 Ball and help look out for the next 5 to 10 years with all the different things that have been going on. We've talked about demographic clips, we've talked about Huron report, etc. Um, and with all that in mind, it kind of feels, well, things are really going to be not very good 5 to 10 years from now. I mean, what's your view? What do you see?
So to your point, yes, things aren't going to be very good. And there's something good happening because of that, which is that colleges now understand that they're facing an existential crisis. They should have figured that out in 2011, which is when enrollment actually began to decline. We have more than 2 million fewer students than we had in 2011, and nothing happened. Nothing changed. Again, broad brush, almost nothing changed for the entire 2010s. In fact, it got worse. If you remember, the 2010s was the period of scandals at places like Penn State and Michigan State and USC. Billion-dollar payouts for settlements, just things that in any other industry would have incited widespread outrage. And they did in the cases of these colleges and universities as well. But you would have imagined that the people running these institutions would have looked around and said they knew what was happening demographically. They knew that the demographic cliff was coming. They knew that people started having fewer children in the Great Recession in 2008. So that when those kids turned 18 years later, the absence of those kids would begin to affect their enrollments. But all they were paying attention to was the next year's entering class. Now universities have focused on their futures. Faculty know colleagues who at other institutions have lost their jobs or whose majors have been eliminated or whose colleges have closed. And suddenly I'm seeing much more widespread acceptance of reform. So at conventional colleges, I think people are going to try new things. They might be good things, they might be bad things. There's a lot of changes that colleges are making that are a little too late. Small colleges, for example, that think that online higher education is the future. Yeah, maybe it is, but they're too late because it's already been monopolized by large players like Western Governors and Southern New Hampshire. But reduced credit 3-year degrees, great idea. Should have happened 10 years ago, but it's happening now at least. That attracts students that might otherwise not have gone to college. Changing the liberal arts so that you can show employers what specific skills students have learned, and provide a list of micro-credentials that they've earned during their time at a liberal arts college. That is an immediate response to consumer demand for a return on the investment. So good things are happening there. More kinds of education after high school are going to emerge. Short-term programs, short-term certificates, those are going to be turbocharged by short-term Pell when it takes effect this summer. Dual enrollment is having a huge impact on the pace at which students graduate and the credits with which they enter college. All of those things mean that people are going to finally be trying things. Some will work and some won't. Some colleges will still close, but I think we have their attention. And that is because I want to be an optimist about the future. And my optimism suggests that now finally they get it. And to a degree, there are still a lot of things they should be doing, as we've discussed. But yeah, I think that there's some expectation for some better outcomes down the road.
Very good. Kent, over to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jon. This conversation reminds us and our listeners that there are real people beyond just the data who are having to face an uncertain world and make really difficult choices. We're grateful for your reporting. It helps us better understand those realities. So thank you for your perspective, the clarity that you bring to complex issues, and for the important work that you do. It's indeed a pleasure to read your work. For those of you who are listening or viewing, if you'd like to learn more about Small College America, go to our webpage at www.smallcollegeamerica.net. where you can find details on upcoming episodes, contact us, and even suggest topics or guests you'd like us to invite to the show. Also, I'd like to encourage you to subscribe to our series on your favorite podcast network. This episode of Small College America is made possible with underwriting support from Edu Alliance Group, a higher education consulting firm that champions small colleges and the communities they serve. And if your college or university is involved in podcasting, please be sure to check out Higher Ed PodCon, coming to Cleveland, Ohio on July 16th and 17th. It's a wonderful opportunity to network with professionals who are also doing good work in podcasts. Please visit www.higheredpodcon.com for details. On behalf of our guest, Jon Marcus, and my co-host, Dean Hoke, and myself, I'd like to thank you for joining us. Jon, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on.